So the Gemara that we're dealing with here is a Gemara that is trying to clarify what the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda really is. So there's a rabbi here called Rabbi Yehuda, and he has a view that's unclear. Why is it unclear? It's unclear because if I tell you that something is okay, so you know that if you did it, it's okay. But you don't know if that's the preferable way to do it. Because all I said was, if you did it, okay, it's okay, it's fine. You did it, okay, it's good, it's okay. You don't know if I mean to say, well, that's preferable, that's fine in the first place, or if that's just okay after the fact that you did it, then it's, we'll let it go. And that's really what the Gemara is going to be dealing with here, because there's a number of statements that you could read both ways. And the problem is that a Mishnah, no matter how you write it, it's going to end up being a little vague. Why? Because if you read what is the preferable, if you say in the Mishnah, what is the preferable way of saying Shema, and then you have an argument of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi, so now you'll know that Rabbi Yehuda will say this is the preferable way of Shema, and Rabbi Yossi would say this is the preferable way of Shema, but you won't know that if they did it in a non-preferable way, if it was kosher, right? You're not going to know that because you'll just know what the preferable ways are. Now, if they argue on what's kosher, then you'll just know after the fact what is okay, but you won't know what's the preferable way. So every Mishnah is going to have this, this is a common issue in the Mishnayos. Are they dealing with after the fact, if it's okay, or are they dealing with the preferable manner of doing things the most appropriate way? So I'm going to start the Mishnah one more time because you really need to have the whole flow in order to get to understand the Gemara. We did the Mishnah. I understand we did a little of the Gemara, but we need to read the Mishnah again to be able to get the flow. So I'm starting from the Mishnah on page 15a. Hakoirei es Shema. If a person reads the Shema, v'lo hishmi'a la'oznoi, and he did not hear it to his ears. He didn't say it loud enough that he would hear it with his ears. He just said the words. Yatsa, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, the Mishnah doesn't say who says Yatsa here, but we know that this must be Reb Yehuda. We can understand it from the Gemara. We can understand it. Tosfos over here says you could see it from the end of the Mishnah, that this opinion is the opinion of Reb Yehuda. Reb Yehuda says you have fulfilled your obligation, even though you didn't hear it. You have fulfilled your obligation. A person who read Shema, he didn't hear it, he has fulfilled his obligation. Now, let me ask you, so is that preferable that you could say the Shema without hearing it? Or is it okay?
Oh, God.
What do you think?
Every rabbi is going to say
it's just okay.
We don't know. The answer is we don't know. Because the Mishnah says, if you did it, it's okay. And we're stuck in the dark. We don't really know if this is a preferable, if this, according to Rabbi Yehuda, is that a preferable way also, that you could do that in a preferable way? Or is that only after the fact, you did it, you have fulfilled your obligation? We don't know. It's unclear. Now, you could try to prove me wrong now and say it is clear.
No, it's not.
Think of the words. The Mishnah says, if you did this, it's okay. If you did it, it's okay. Now, maybe you could bring proof that that means that it's not the preferable way.
Well, just from the wording, that tells you that it's not the preferable way.
Okay, so Yehuda says, you look at the words. Why did it choose these words? That if you did it, it's okay. It should say, this is the way to say Shema. Let it say, if this was the preferable way, then it should use different words. It shouldn't say, if you did it, it's okay. It should say, here is how you should say Shema. Say the words, even if you don't hear them. Right? That's what you're saying, right? So you have a little proof, right? So I'm wrong. It is clear, right? It's pretty clear. Yehuda says it's very clear from the Mishnah. But the only thing is not exactly so. It sounds good, but there's a problem with that. The problem with that is that let's take a look at Rabbi Yossi's opinion. Rabbi Yossi Omer lo yatsa. Rabbi Yossi says you have not fulfilled your obligation.
Right.
Rabbi Yossi says you didn't fulfill your obligation even after the fact. Now, what would happen if we worded the Mishnah the way Yehuda wants to word it? And we'll say the Mishnah says that here is the way to say Shema preferably. And Rabbi Yehuda says, you say the words, even if you don't hear them, that's preferable. Rabbi Yossi says you have to hear them. What will happen then? Everything sounds fine and dandy, except for the fact that we don't know the main point that Rabbi Yossi would say, guess what? If you didn't do it the preferable way, you didn't fulfill your obligation. Right. However, the way the Mishnah says it, now we know the main point, which is after the fact, Rabbi Yossi would say you didn't even fulfill your obligation. If it worded it the other way, we wouldn't know what would be the law after the fact, according to Rabbi Yossi. Again, let's word it the way Yehuda wanted to word it. The Mishnah's the Mishnah's wording should be, this is the way one should recite the Shema. Rabbi Yehuda says, say the words even if you don't hear them. Rabbi Yossi says, you have to hear the words. So that would be the way the Mishnah will say it. The Mishnah will say those words. And then if I were to ask you, well, what happens if I did not hear the words that I said? You'll tell me, well, according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's for sure okay, because that's preferable. And according to Rabbi Yossi, we're in the dark. We don't know what the final conclusion would be after the fact. If you didn't hear the words, we know that he says the preferable way is to say, to hear the words. But if you didn't hear the words, we won't know the final law. So therefore, the Mishnah picks a case where you said the Shema already and you did not hear the words. And here the Rabbi Yossi says you did not fulfill your obligation. And now we know the final law. After the fact, you really have to go back and do it again, according to Rabbi Yossi. So in other words, why did the Mishnah pick these words to word it this way? We're either going to benefit by understanding the preferable way, or we're going to benefit by knowing after the fact what the law is. And by the fact that the Mishnah chose these words, it's basically telling us that the law after the fact. It's picking a case of after the fact to tell you what the law is after the fact, but it's leaving out what the law will be in the preferable case, and that is really.
But it's not the preferable way.
Well, it'll tell you according to Rabbi Yossi that it's not the preferable way, but it could be Rabbi Yehuda would say both. This after the fact you're Yotze, and that is the preferable way. But after the fact you're not Yotze, Rabbi Yossi says, because the preferable way is to do it differently. So in other words, the fact that it's picking a case of after the fact is telling you, according to one of those views, this is not going to be the preferable way. But it's not telling you both views would say that. In other words, you're right. One of the views is definitely going to argue and say this is not the preferable way. And in our Mishnah, it would be Rabbi Yossi. He says you're not fulfilling your obligation. But if in the first place, you have to do it differently. But now Rabbi Yehuda, we don't know if this is the preferable way also, or is it not the preferable way, but you fulfilled your obligation? Again, one opinion for sure that this is not the preferable way, and that's why the Mishnah is choosing this. But because we have two views, so we don't really know if this is the preferable way or it's only after the fact, because there's two views in the Mishnah. According to one view, it's only choosing this case because of, according to that one view, it only works after the fact. But because we have two views
times now, but I don't see the word preferable. Maybe I'm missing something. One says it's fulfilled, but I don't see anywhere saying that one is preferable against the other. Okay,
right.
so that leaves me in a quandary. And so again, you got two answers, but then again, it goes further into the Gemara where it's what Tana Kama rules that again, he fulfills his obligation even when he does not hear the Shema, and holds that the word hear is needed to teach that you may recite the Shema in any language that you hear. All right, so that complicates it a little more.
Well, Robert, let me just explain the reason why you don't see it in the Mishnah about the preferable case is because we were talking theoretically that it would be nice.
No, I understand that. I understand that.
Yeah.
Okay, it's a hierarchy to say preferable. Okay,
but we're understanding.
I appreciate that.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Either the two rabbis, Yossi and Yehuda, is either one, has more experience or more knowledge?
No.
And should we really follow?
They're both in the same level, according to our understanding.
Okay.
And they're both written in the Mishnah. That means
difference of discussion. This is a difference of. Okay, thank you.
No problem. Ben.
I want to say I side with Yehuda. From the wording, I got immediately the feeling that it's not the preferred way. Because for one thing, they didn't even mention his name. They just made a statement in somebody's name and said it's good after the fact. But then they give Yossi's name and say he says no.
Oh, that's interesting.
Rabbi.
Well, it's got to pick one first.
So we
I don't
know
know if
that
that's
they're going
proof.
to go into back and forth on it.
Interesting.
Okay. I mean, I hear you, but it doesn't have to pick one name. So it just happened to pick this name first.
They're going to go into it.
Rabbi.
I hear you, Ben, but I don't exactly agree. The reason I don't agree with you,
Rabbi, not just from the fact that there was no name.
Okay. Well, we'll see in the Gemara. Let's see how how everything develops in the Gemara. Yes, Moshe.
Okay.
Which one holds to be more machmir in his position? Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi? Usually in their pasking,
Who do you think? You tell me.
I would think, well,
when it comes to hearing your words,
if they're both saying the same thing under these circumstances, it's
read the first line of the Mishnah to me. Read the first line of the Mishnah.
Okay, I'm going to translate in English. One who recites Shema and did not recite in a manner audible to his own ear, either because he read inaudibly or because he is deaf, fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Yossi says he did not fulfill his obligation.
So who's more machmir?
Well, Yossi, Rabbi Yossi, I would say.
Okay, you got it.
Okay, so but is that usually the case with him? I don't know.
Oh.
I mean, from seeing some of his other.
The interesting thing is, if you look at the next line of the Mishnah, you see that he says the exact opposite. In another case,
interesting.
He actually will be. So there's no such thing as saying, it's hard to say, so one rabbi is always machmir or always makel, always strict or always lenient. I know we commonly say that Beis Shammai was more machmir and Beis Hillel, there you might find that. I don't know which one in general would be more machmir. You know what I mean? I guess we would have to go through, if you stay with me, as I say, for like 49 years, hopefully we'll finish the whole Talmud and in about 49 years, and we'll decide.
Only if we're going to have a siyum after this Masechet.
Okay. I would like to continue. Ben, yes.
Rabbi,
Ben. Yes.
Rabbi, the second line is another issue already.
Yeah. It's true, but does it show about his level of leniency or strictness?
Is not.
It's not connected, but it does show about his personality.
But he's talking about a different issue.
Yeah, but it does show about his personality. In other words, the way he thinks. His mind is more of a machmir soul, or his soul is more of a lenient soul. It does say something. It's definitely something to take into consideration. In other words, there is a connection between the soul and a person's views, and it's not because they are emotionally connected to some. It's something to do with their soul that they see things in a certain way. So Moshe is not wrong. He's got a point. There are certain, Beis Shammai's soul had a leaning towards being machmir. He's right. He has a point. It's just that we normally don't know who's machmir and who's. So the Mishnah said that if you didn't hear your with your ears, but you said the words, is an argument. Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says you fulfilled your obligation. Rabbi Yossi says you didn't fulfill your obligation. And now we're jumping to the second piece of the Gemara, which is Tanan Hassam. It's let's see. Tanan Hassam is exactly halfway down the page, and the first word on the line. Tanan Hassam. Tanan Hassam. We learned over there. Cheresh, a deaf person, Hamadaber ve'enoi shemeya, that speaks and doesn't hear. Now, the reason why the Gemara says this, a deaf person, it's a Mishnah, excuse me. The Mishnah says a deaf person that speaks and doesn't hear. The reason why it says that is often in the Mishnah, when it talks about a deaf person, it refers to someone who's deaf and mute together. And therefore here the Mishnah clarifies it. And it says, we're talking about someone who's only deaf, but they can speak. So someone who's deaf, Lo Yitrim should not take truma preferably. V'im taram truma say truma. And if they did take truma, then their truma is considered valid. So they shouldn't take truma. And we've explained this Gemara yesterday, that the Gemara means that because you can't hear the bracha, so because you can't say the bracha, it's preferable not to be the one to take truma. We'd rather someone else takes the truma. If you did it, you're yaitze. You have fulfilled your obligation. So the question is, who is the source of this Mishnah? Who is the source of this Mishnah that says that if you did take if you did take truma, your truma is considered a good acting? The Gemara gives an answer that it's going to be Reb Yossi. Now I know you would all like to say it's Reb Yehuda, and the Gemara is going to try to say Reb Yehuda. The Gemara is going to try to say Reb Yehuda later on in the Gemara, but here the Gemara is not up to that, and it's really going to say that it's going to say Reb Yossi. Yes, Howard. I can't hear you.
I had a question.
Howard, you're muted.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Just a quick question about Brochos in general. Are they supposed to be said audibly?
Yes, for sure. I mean,
so if you're saying a bracha to yourself, you're actually supposed to audibilize it?
Generally, we always, well, you know what? I should look it up in Shulchan Aruch before I say it. Let me look it up.
Okay. I didn't know if it was complicated.
You actually hear yourself saying it. Let me look it up. I shouldn't. I shouldn't
Rabbi,
thank you.
Say any answer without looking it up. Yes.
What I'm wondering is the one that's more machmir. Is that ordinarily the one that would be considered more on the side of Gebura? And the one that's more lenient on the side of Chesed, does it work like that? All right. Oh, it does. It does work like that.
Correct.
Okay.
So the Gemara says here, who is going to be this view that by a deaf person should not take truma preferably, but if they did, the truma is valid. This is going to go like, who does this go like? So the Gemara says, Rav Chizda, Rabbi Yossi. Rav Chizda says this is Rabbi Yossi. Everyone have the place? Titnan, as we learned in the Mishnah, and this This is bringing our Mishnah that we just read. Hakoire, it's in the Gemara, but it's bringing the statement from our Mishnah. Hakoire Yeshma, if a person did read the Shema, and he didn't hear it, Yatza, he is Yaitze. He didn't hear it with his ears, but he did say the words. He is Yaitze, he has fulfilled his obligation. And these are the words of Reb Yehuda. Questionable if you actually have those printed there, or it's just obvious that those are the words of Reb Yehuda. Reb Yosi Amar Lo Yatza. Reb Yosi says you have not fulfilled your obligation. And Reb Yosi here is talking about the biblical obligation of Shema that you didn't fulfill. But when it comes to Truma, you did fulfill your obligation after the fact. I'd kind of like Amar Reb Yosi until here. Reb Yosi doesn't say his law that Lo Yatza, that you didn't fulfill your obligation. Ela gabe kriyash madaraisa. He only says this law regarding Shema, which is biblical. Aval truma, but separating truma mishum brachahu ubracha derabanan. In a number one, the bracha is rabbinic. In number two, it doesn't matter if you said the bracha or not. Because the fact is, the separation of truma is not dependent on the bracha. And therefore, although Rabbi Yossi would say preferably this person should not be the one to separate truma, he should have a emissary separate the truma, or one of his kids should separate the truma, maybe an adult child if he has a kid that's bar mitzvah, but if he did it himself, he didn't hire someone else. If he did it himself, he has fulfilled his obligation. So again, Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah said you didn't fulfill your obligation with regard to Shema, but with regard to the Truma, you did fulfill your obligation because there is a difference between the two. With regard to the separating Truma, the main thing is the action of separating the Truma. The bracha is an extra bonus. It's a cherry on top. You didn't do the bracha properly because you said the bracha, you didn't hear it. You're not going to hear it. So that's another story. Fine, you shouldn't do it, but if you did it, you did it. But the Shema, the main thing is the recital. So if the main thing is the recital by the Shema, if you didn't hear it, you didn't fulfill your obligation. So the Gemara sees these two statements to fit hand in hand. It's not exact, but it could be the same view, could follow the same view because there are differences, different laws, different values in each of these mitzvahs. Okay, so the Gemara says that the Gemara now asks the question that why are you saying this, that it fits with Rabbi Yossi. But before I do that, let's think for a second. According to this way of reading the Gemara, how is our Gemara understanding the Mishnah? Our Gemara is understanding the Mishnah, and Rabbi Yossi is saying that not only is it not preferable, but you didn't even fulfill your obligation. So our Mishnah is, according to this way of understanding, is that a preferable way of saying Shema? By saying it very low and not hearing yourself, would that be a preferable way of saying Shema? In the case of Truma, it says that you shouldn't do it in the first place. It's not preferable. So it doesn't really fit with Rabbi Yehuda. That's the way the first Gemara is understanding, obviously. And therefore the Gemara says, you know what? This fits with Rabbi Yossi. Doesn't fit with Rabbi Yehuda. Because Rabbi Yehuda is probably going to say that the preferable way of saying Shema, you don't have to hear it in the first place. So it doesn't really fit with the case of Truma. So now we understand why the Gemara is jumping to Rabbi Yossi. But now the Gemara is going that there are two ways of reading our Mishnah. Based on the two ways of how you read it, you're going to decide if our Mishnah fits with Rabbi Yossi's view, or you'll say our Mishnah fits with Rabbi Yehuda's view. So the Gemara now says, "Umimai de Rabbi Yossi he, Dilma Rabbi Yehuda he." How do you know that it's Rabbi Yossi? Maybe it fits with Rabbi Yehuda. Amar gabe kriyash manami diavad in lechatchila loy. In Rabbi Yehuda's view, really is, although it doesn't say it clearly, but it fits with the Mishnah, and it would basically be saying that that it's the eved. Oh, it's only the eved that you have fulfilled. It's only after the fact that you should say it louder. You should say Shema very loud. So a person maybe who's hard of hearing should say it very loud. And or if you were in an area where it's very noisy, maybe you would have to go to another area to hear the Shema. Or so this would be the truma like this. Then you have fulfilled your obligation. So then it would fit very well. It would flow very well. Rabbi Yehuda here, and the opinion there we would say, you know what? That's also Rabbi Yehuda. So now I'd just like to know how many people I lost over here.
All these different ideas about who they wanted to see as maybe that's what this is all about, really.
No.
Well, the only problem with that is that we're dealing here with rabbis that were holy of holies who had no interest in their own enjoyment, and they cared only to understand what God wanted. Only what God wants. Choose what they think people will go for. They don't care what God. So we are totally in a different world than them. These rabbis here, they understand the Torah differently. They're looking to understand the Torah in the most sincere and honest way of what does God want, and they see different things when they read it. People read things and have different understandings, and that's what God wanted, that people should, they should discuss it and share their on this, Robert. Can you understand what we're saying?
I understand it.
So I'm going to go further.
We'll go forward. Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, the Gemara continues and it explains why it fits with Rabbi Yehuda.
Beg your pardon?
I'm going to start from the first word on the line, Dilma Rabbi Yehuda he. Maybe this fits with Rabbi Yehuda. V'amar, this is not okay to say Shema in this manner, where you don't hear it. And the same thing would apply to the case of Truma. And that this way, Rabbi Yehuda, he did it. It means if he did it, he's fulfilled his obligation. But it's only after the fact. That's not the preferable way to do it. See it, it's not the preferable way. So the Gemara says, the Amri, they say, no, it's not a proof. Hi Diktani Hakoire. This that it says Hakoire, this that it says, if he did it that way, he's fulfilled his obligation. That's all. Or if he did it that way, Rabbi Yehuda says he's fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Yossi says he hasn't fulfilled his obligation. It's L'Haidiach HaKoiche de Rabbi Yossi. This shows the extremism, the extreme view of Rabbi Yossi, the power of Rabbi Yossi, the Amar, that he said, the Eved Nami Loi, that even after the fact, you have not fulfilled your obligation. So why does it pick a case of after the fact? To tell you that there is an opinion that says after the fact you haven't fulfilled your obligation. If it only spoke about the preferable case, you wouldn't know what would be the law of after the fact, that one view says that you're not even fulfilled your obligation. You wouldn't know that. So therefore it picks a case of after the fact to tell you, Yossi, because it needs to tell us that. We want to know what Rabbi Yossi would hold after the fact, because that's a very important point. It's even more important than knowing what's good preferably, because at least you fulfilled your obligation. After the fact is a lot better than the preferable law. Preferable law, okay, this is preferable, it's not so preferable. I want to know what the bottom line is. Bottom line to me sounds a little more valuable. So the Mishnah picked the case of bottom line rather than preferable. It didn't pick a case of what's preferable.
Wow, interesting.
So even preferably, you would have fulfilled your obligation, maybe. In other words, you could learn the mission. Mission is talking about after the fact. But what would be the case of preferably? Same thing. Rabbi Yehuda would say the same exact thing, that you fulfilled your obligation. It's fine. You don't need to hear it. Going to fit Rabbi Yossi's view here with the Truma view, with the view that we spoke about with regard to Truma. And it fits with Rabbi Yossi. It's not going to fit with Rabbi Yehuda because, again, Rabbi Yehuda, we are learning, would say, take Truma. There's no problem. Rabbi Yossi, why are we learning it this way? Ve'elo hadatanya, but there is a brisa that we learned. Lo yavarich, a person should not. Excuse me. Let me reword that. I didn't mean to say those words. A person shouldn't say grace after meals if he doesn't hear himself. The im beirach, and if he did say grace after meals and he did not hear himself, yotza, he has. Now we've got a very interesting scenario. Why do we have an interesting scenario? Because the earlier case, before we spoke about two cases. We spoke about Shema, which was biblical, a biblical obligation to recite something. And we said that Rabbi Yossi would say that you have not fulfilled your obligation if you didn't hear it. And we have the case of the rabbinic case of saying a bracha for truma and saying a bracha for truma where it's rabbinic. And we said over there that after the fact, you have fulfilled your obligation according to Rabbi Yossi. But the problem is that here we have a case that's biblical. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're allowed to say Shema and not hear it. Rabbi Yehuda says,
Rabbi,
yes.
Your daughter's putting the cap of the pen in her mouth.
Yeah, it's okay.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah. But thank you. I saw that. So the if you didn't hear it, you didn't fulfill your obligation. So we've got two extremes. Rabbi Yehuda is very lenient. You don't even have to hear it. No problem. Don't even say it out loud. Meals and grace after meals, we've got some intermediate view, but it can't go like Rabbi Yehuda. It can't go like Rabbi Yossi. We've got this intermediate view. Who's it going to go like? By the case of grace after meals, it says, don't say grace after meals if you don't hear it. But if you did say it and you didn't hear it, you fulfilled your obligation. So the Gemara says, Mani lo Rabbi Yosef lo Rabbi Yehuda. That's not going to go like Rabbi Yossi or Rabbi Yehuda. Di Rabbi Yehuda, if you want to say it'll go like Rabbi Yehuda, if it would be Rabbi Yehuda, Ha'amar, Rabbi Yehuda said, L'chatchila nami yotza. You're even fulfilling your obligation in a preferable way with regard to Shema. So you don't even, it's not like you shouldn't do it. So rather, what should we say? Let's switch around what we planned, what we concluded before. And let's say that preferably Rabbi Yehuda was saying you shouldn't do this, but after the fact, then it's okay. And maybe now we're going to reprogram our mind. We have to reprogram ourselves. Initially, we wanted to say Rabbi Yehuda is talking about both preferably and after the fact, both of them are the same. And now we're reprogramming our mind and saying, no, let's change things around now because we're stuck. We have a case of grace after meals where we see clearly there's a law that there's a preferable way of doing it and there's after the fact way of doing it. And this is a biblical case. And we know Rabbi Yossi, when it comes to biblical cases, he says, even in a preferable way, he says you're not, forget about preferable. He says, even after the fact, you haven't fulfilled your obligation, Rabbi Yossi. And Rabbi Yehuda, initially we thought, said that even preferably, you're allowed to say it this way without hearing it. And so now we're stuck with grace after meals. It's a biblical case and we don't have anyone to follow. We don't have any view to follow. So now we're going to reprogram ourselves. And let's say that Rabbi Yehuda's talking only about a case of after the fact. But if you want to say it this way, we tell you don't. This is not a preferable way to recite Shema or to say grace after meals. So that's the way the Gemara. However, Ella Hadatani Rabbi Yehuda Bereid Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi. But what are we going to do with the next case? How are we going to learn this? Rabbi Yehuda, this that we learned, Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, I'm sorry, the son of Rabbi Shimon ben Pazi, not in the name of. You can take truma in the first place. A person who's deaf is allowed to separate truma even in the first place. And Rabbi Yossi, because he would say you can't take truma in the first place. You're not hearing the bracha. We can't follow Rabbi Yehuda. So who is this going to go like? So the Gemara answers. Let me read it inside. Can take a person who's deaf can separate truma even in a preferable manner. Mani, who will this go like? Loi Rabbi Yehuda v'loi Rabbi Yossi. It can't go like Rabbi Yehuda, and it can't go like Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda, if it would go like Rabbi Yehuda, ha'amar di'abed in l'chatchila loi. We just concluded and reprogrammed ourselves to say that Rabbi Yehuda says that if you can't hear it, then you shouldn't do it in the first place. It's only after the fact. And here we're saying that a person who's deaf can separate truma even in the first place. Rabbi Yossi, if you want to say it fits with Rabbi Yossi, ha'amar diavad nami loy, Rabbi Yossi says even after the fact you have not fulfilled your obligation. So we're really stuck here. Well, the problem we have is it seems pretty clear that there are three views and we only have two rabbis. and that's really what we're dealing with. And even the two rabbis that we have, one of them is a little vague. So we're really, what exactly he holds, we're trying to prove it from different sources, very hard. Ella, the Gemara says, rather, li'olam Rabbi Yehuda. Really, this will fit with Rabbi Yehuda, this statement that it's preferable to take truma. This statement will fit with Rabbi Yehuda, that even a deaf person can take truma in the first place, no problems. Va'afilu lechatchila nami, and even preferably, he's allowed to take truma. And this that we said before about truma, that a deaf person shouldn't separate truma, like kasha, it's not a question. Hadi day, this is Rabbi Yehuda saying his own view. Hadi Rabbe, this is Rabbi Yehuda saying his rabbi's view, his teacher's view. Meaning Rabbi Yehuda's teacher was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, and he taught one way, and Rabbi Yehuda is of the opinion different. So the Tanan, because we learned in a Mishnah, or the Tanya, there's on the side it says it should be the Tanya, we learned in a Brisa, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Mishum Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, a person who recites the Shema needs to hear it with his ears. Shenamar, as it says, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Hear, O Israel, you have to hear it. Amar le Reb Meir, and then Reb Meir argues, and he says, Harehu Aimer, Asher Anochi Mitzavcha Hayoim Al Levavecha. It says that I command you today, it should be on your heart. You don't have to hear it. So he's trying to figure out what's the law. Reb Meir says it says on your heart. You don't have to hear it. Reb Yehuda, your heart, meaning as long as it's in your heart, you didn't hear it, it's okay. So what comes out is we see clearly that Reb Yehuda's Rebbe was of the opinion that there is a preferable way to say Shema that you have to hear it. After the fact, maybe you fulfilled your obligation, but the self maybe is very lenient, and he says you don't even have to hear it in the first place. And Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, his teacher, says you got to hear it, but if you didn't, you fulfilled your obligation. And this will be the third view. So again, we'll have Rabbi Yehuda, your obligation, even after the fact. So these will be the three views. But now the Gemara says, why are we saying this? That Rabbi Yehuda argues on his Rebbe.
Maybe one of the rabbis is hard of hearing.
No. One second. Why are we saying that Rabbi Yehuda argues on his Rebbe? There is an easier option. We just found another rabbi's name here. Who is the other rabbi that we just mentioned? We just mentioned the fourth name. We've got Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, Reb Meir. We have we until now we have Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Yehuda's Rebbe, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Now we just found the fourth name, Reb Meir. And what does Reb Meir say? That all you need to do is have kavanas halev, have intent with your heart. You don't even have to hear it with your ears. So let's say that Rabbi Yehuda follows his Rebbe's opinion that preferably you do have to hear it with your ears. If you didn't, you fulfill your obligation. And Reb Meir is the lenient view. Let's move Reb Meir to the lenient view. Rabbi Yehuda and his Rebbe in the middle, they're the middle view. And Rabbi Yossi is the extreme view that you didn't fulfill your obligation. So now that's the way the Gemara concludes. Let me read it inside. Kashta the asis lahachi. Now that we've come to here, when we found this other brisa, afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda k'Rabbeis virale. Even if you say Rabbi Yehuda holds like his Rebbe, Reb Meir, who's very lenient, and this is Reb Yehuda, who's a little more strict. And so that's seems like the conclusion. Seems like the conclusion of the Gemara. Okay, so at this point, if you have questions, you could ask, or maybe we'll continue. Miranda.
Yeah, the fact that it should be upon your heart doesn't exclude it from you saying it. It's two different statements, isn't it?
That's
One
true.
has to do keeping it in your heart, like as an intention. But so I don't know that he's saying you shouldn't say it, that it's just enough, but he's bringing up the biblical facts, but I don't understand it totally. So I don't understand it. Yeah.
So you have to understand, it's a good question you're asking. Miranda's asking a very good question, that one place it says you got to hear it. Another place it says it has to be the intent of your heart. And so the problem is, why does Reb Meir say this is the main one? What about the other one? The other one seems to say you got to hear it. He's not. So the answer is that Reb Meir obviously is going to learn something else out of the word Shema. So that's not extra. And this one he sees as the main legal rules of the Shema. This is where it's all about the heart. In other words, when it's talking about the most important part of the Shema and how it should be done, Al levavecha. That's it. That's the crux of the rules. So that should answer your question. Yes, Moshe.
He said yes, Moshe.
Yes, Moshe.
Har Sinai, they were also.
We can't hear you. You're muted.
In Har Sinai,
you're muted.
He's not muted. He's not speaking directly to his computer.
Can you hear me? So, they were expected to say in Har Sinai, they were expected to say the Shema.
Okay.
Everybody had to hear it. The Kahal had to hear it. Not only was it in their heart, but it was it had to be heard by everybody because it had to be acknowledged. By everybody. That they had emunah.
No.
I could not hear you, but it sounds like Ezra understood you and wants to answer. So Ezra, why don't you take it over?
Rabbi Azaria is more mocker than Rabbi Yehuda, his teacher. Obviously.
Yeah, we can't hear him.
I cannot hear you. Ezra, did you hear Moshe? Did you want to answer that?
Well, I mean, my feeling is that, yes, it should be on your heart. You have to internalize it. That's number one. Number two, you should hear it, but it's not, when he says, for those who say that that you should hear your words, it's for you to be able to hear, not everybody else to hear.
But it creates achdut. It creates achdut.
No, it doesn't. For me, it turns me completely off when somebody else is drowning me out when I'm saying the Shema.
Okay. Everybody's different, but everybody's different,
Okay. I guess that's an interesting discussion. Can be nice to hear different views. Robert.
Well, I understand saying the Shema is a proclamation. A proclamation is try the blessing, okay? So to me, there's a balance of the sincerity and the proclamation versus, there are always people in shul who have to be the center of attention. We know that.
Okay.
That's
very good.
What I will say is that the Sfardim do say it all together, but nobody tries to outdo the other when they're saying it. So in the sense of achdut, yeah, I can understand that. But when, one person basically tries to step over you when he's saying it, that to me goes way beyond the bound. And in fact, my suggestion is to do something right now. Start saying the Shema to yourself and slowly increase the level of what you're saying. And you'll see that you have a very, very, very low threshold to be able to hear yourself say the Shema. Hear yourself. You don't have to yell it loudly. In fact, I can go like this right now, and I can hear myself. That doesn't take very much.
It depends on the situation. Some people say the Shema just before then.
No, the
maybe,
point,
you know,
and here is for you. The point here is for you to hear it.
Right.
Not everybody else in the world to hear it.
To the distraction of what they're doing.
Okay. Let me, we have 1 minute left. Let me start the next Gemara so we'll get a little
Rabbi,
head start.
Rabbi, I just had a quick question.
Yeah.
When we're saying something is fact, does that mean that the next day the person has the same situation and at the outset he says the after the fact view? You follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, David is asking a very good question. I've translated the words very literally, and it's not wrong, but there is something that has to be added, and that is that b'di'evad means when it was done, after the fact. That's the literal translation. However, there often are cases where you're in a very complicated situation. And that's also called, you know, when it's a very serious situation, like, for example, a person has no money and they are in a really tough situation. So we would tell them, b'di'evad, since it's okay if after the fact, you can even do it in the first case because you have no money or because your family is all stressed out from some other issue or, you know, there's some other issue. So b'di'evad doesn't only mean after the fact. It also means when when there are other conflict to the fact that it could apply if a person's sick, a person, you know, so what's okay after the fact is also okay in a preferable way for someone who's sick or someone, you know, who's in a complicated situation. So that's the translation. I think that answers your question. I didn't hear you out completely, David, but does that answer your question?
Already, you know, if it's already, yeah, if it's already deemed okay with you, b'di'evad after the fact, can you use it again? Right, the day after day.
You can't use it again unless you're really in the same situation that you need to.
Yeah.
You know, if you're in the same situation. But if you're not, just because you once relied on this because of b'di'evad, that doesn't mean you should rely on it again. No, absolutely not. It's only after the fact that it was good or in your extenuating situation that it was allowed. It's not something that should be relied on in the first place. There's a preferable way of doing a mitzvah, and then there's a you know, extenuating circumstance